Hey, in Angular, we often want two-way communication between our parent component and its child component. The parent passes a value to the child component. The child component modifies that value and passes the changed value back to the parent. Accomplishing this task used to be a bit complicated. The child component would define an input property to get the value from the parent component and define an output property to send a notification event with the new value. Starting in Angular version 17.2, we now have a new model input. The model input makes it easy to two-way bind data between a parent component and a child component. In this video, we examine the new model input. We then walk through how to react to changes in that input, first using event binding, then using computed signals. Let's jump in. I'm using StackBlitz in the same demo application we looked at for signal input. If you aren't familiar with signal inputs, check out my video, Angular's New Signal Inputs. That video is linked above and in this video's notes. I've made one change since we last saw this code. We want to reuse this filter feature in other parts of the application, so I moved it from the main snack component to its own child component. Here is the main snack component. It now has two child components, the filter component here that handles entry of the filter, and the snack list component here that displays the filtered set of snacks. Looking at the filter component, it contains the HTML to display the filter by box. But notice that our code doesn't work. That's because as the user enters a filter value, that value is assigned to this local variable in the filter component. And in the snack component, we have a different local variable and pass its value to the snack list for filtering. Going back to the filter component, let's change the name of this property to just filter, here and here. That way it's clear that this is a different variable. Remember this property name because we'll use it in a moment. Looking at the parent component, our task then is to pass the value of list filter to the child component. And when the user changes the value in the child component, to pass the changed value back to this parent component. This sounds like a job for two-way binding. We want to two-way bind the child component's filter property to the parent component's list filter property. Then we pass that list filter property to the snack list component to filter the list. By using two-way binding, the parent component passes in an initial value and receives back any changes to that value. But notice our syntax error. We need to set up the child component for two-way binding. Looking at the child component, previously setting a child component up for two-way binding required creating an input property to take in the initial value and creating an output property to notify the parent of any changed value. But not anymore. Starting with Angular 17.2, we now have model inputs. A model input allows us to two-way bind a signal between a parent component and a child component. Cool! We define the model input in the child component. In this case, our filter component. We define the filter as a model input. Filter equals model parentheses. We use the quick fix to add the needed import. Since this is a signal, it must always have a value, so we provide an initial value of empty string. Looking at the preview window and entering a filter string, our code works! Wow, look at that! That was so easy! Let's talk through that again. Here in the child component, we define a property as a model input using the model function. Because we use model inputs for two-way binding, the resulting signal is writable. Then here in the parent component, we simply use two-way binding to bind the model input property to a parent component property. The value of this property is passed to the child component, and the parent component gets back any changed value. Let's try setting an initial value here. I'll set it to nut. Now we see that our application sets that initial value into the child component. Then the user can change the value, and that changed value is passed back to the parent component, so we are getting two-way communication of that value. I'll change the initial value back to an empty string. This feature is so cool! What else can we do with it? As with the signal input, we can alias the model input variable. With an alias, we expose a more detailed or user-friendly name for the parent component to use, but then define a shorter or more technical name for use in the child component code. Going back to the child component, the model input has a second argument for options. We type curly braces, alias, and the aliased name. Let's call it filter criteria. Note that model options do not include transform, and this makes sense because the resulting signal is writable. Now in the parent snack component, we change the binding to the alias name, filter criteria. Trying it out, our filter still works. But what if the parent component forgets to specify the binding? If I type in a filter, it looks like the filtering doesn't work, but in reality, the parent component isn't getting the user-entered value from the filter component. Is there something we can do about that? Yep, we can make a model input required. Going back to the filter component, we add .required onto our model. Since the value is required, we no longer need an initial value, so remove the first argument. And we get a syntax error. The code won't compile unless the parent component passes in the required input. Here in the parent component, we'll undo our deletion to add back our two-way binding. What if we want to run some code in the parent component when the child component changes the value? Say, for example, we want the parent component to display the length of the filter string. In Angular, two-way binding is a shortcut syntax for property binding plus event binding. So when necessary, we can change our two-way binding to its longer form. I'll comment out our original two-way binding and add the child component. Then we property bind the filter criteria property to our list filter variable. That provides the initial value to the child component. But what about the event binding? Luckily for us, the model input defines an implicit event. It's named with the model input property name and the word change. So in our case, it's filter criteria change. I'll put it on a new line for more space. Then we define a method to execute when the event occurs. Let's call it process filter. We use $event to specify that we want the child component to pass the modified value with the event. And we use $any so we don't run into any type checking issues with $event. In the component code, we'll add that process filter method. The method takes in a string argument that is the user-entered filter. In the method, we assign the value passed from the child component to our local list filter property. For this particular example, we also want to calculate the length of the filter. Start by creating a new variable called filter length and set it to 0. Then in the process filter method, set this filter length to the entered filter length. Lastly, let's add some HTML to display this length in the parent component. I'll add a div, enddiv, some text, and use interpolation. Now, when we type something in, our event handler receives a notification. Our method assigns our local list filter variable to the new value and assigns the filter length variable to the length. Okay, that seemed like too much work. Is there an easier way to react to changes? What if we used signals? Let's change our list filter to a signal and use the quick fix to add the needed import. We provide an empty string as the initial value. Then we can change our filter length to a computed signal and use the quick fix to add the needed import. The computed doesn't take in a value, so we use parentheses, and we'll define the computed function to this .listFilter. We use parentheses to read the signal value, then .length. Since we change list filter to a signal, we modify the binding for the snack list component and add parentheses. This reads the value of the signal and passes that value to the child component. And we modify the interpolation here. With that, we can change our binding back to two-way binding. I'll delete the expanded syntax and uncomment the two-way binding. And we can delete the process filter method. That looks better. Trying it out, it works. So, in a child component, use a model input anytime you need to pass data back and forth between the parent component and child component. In the parent component, use two-way binding to bind to that input. Then use a signal and computed signal if you want to react to changes to the value provided by the child component. Or, if needed, break the two-way binding into property binding and event binding. This is useful if you need to react to changes in the property and execute some code that goes beyond a computed signal or effect, such as retrieving data. Cool stuff! Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.